At 10:57 in the morning of November 29, 1944, the Japanese aircraft carrier Shinano capsized and sank in the Enshu Sea, approximately 200 kilometers southwest of Tokyo Bay, Japan. She had been struck by 4 torpedoes from the American submarine USS Archerfish at 3:15 that same morning, 7 hours and 42 minutes before she went under. 1,435 of the 2,515 people aboard her died inside the ship as it sank. They died inside her because the compartment doors that would have slowed the flooding had not been installed when the Shinano was commissioned exactly 10 days earlier. The Shinano was the largest warship ever built and the largest aircraft carrier in the history of naval warfare at the time of her commissioning. She was commissioned on November 19, 1944, sailed for the first time on November 28th, and was on the floor of the Enshu Sea on November 29th. Enright would not know the true identity of what he had sunk until after the war ended in August of 1945. 1,435 dead. More than 2,500 men and women had been aboard. 10 days between commissioning and the bottom of the sea. 1 submarine, 4 torpedoes. The largest aircraft carrier ever built lasted less than 2 weeks from commissioning to the bottom of the Enshu Sea. If this story matters to you, subscribe to the channel. Just subscribe. That is all. Thank you. The Shinano began her existence as the 3rd Yamato-class battleship. Her keel was laid in May of 1940 at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal in Japan, the same facility that had built the Yamato. Her design was identical in its essential dimensions to the Yamato and the Musashi, a hull of sufficient displacement to carry 9 18-inch guns and the armor belt necessary to absorb 16-inch shell hits from any battleship afloat. She would have been the 3rd largest battleship ever built when completed and operational. The Battle of Midway in June of 1942 changed fundamentally what she would become. At Midway, Japan lost 4 of its 6 operational fleet carriers in 4 days to American carrier-based dive bombers. The loss was not simply numerical. It included the trained air crews, the operational doctrine, and the accumulated combat experience that those 4 carriers had embodied. The carrier hulls could eventually be replaced by new construction. The trained air crews could not be replaced in the time available. Japan's carrier-based aviation capacity was fundamentally and permanently damaged at Midway, and the Imperial Japanese Navy understood this within weeks. The decision was made to convert the partially complete Shinano hull into a carrier. The conversion presented a specific problem. The Shinano's hull was too advanced in construction to be redesigned as a fleet carrier that could launch and recover attack aircraft efficiently. The solution adopted by the IJN was to convert her into what they called a carrier of carriers. She would not operate her own strike aircraft. She would carry spare aircraft, aviation fuel, ordnance and maintenance equipment forward to the fleet carriers that did operate strike aircraft. She would extend the operational range and endurance of Japan's remaining carrier force by serving as a mobile logistics base with a flight deck. The 50 Oka rocket-powered kamikaze aircraft she was carrying when she sank were part of the ordnance she was transporting to the forces at Leyte Gulf. At approximately 72,000 tons full load displacement, the converted Shinano was substantially larger than any warship that had previously existed in any navy. She remained the largest aircraft carrier ever built until the American USS Forrestal was commissioned in 1955, more than 10 years later. Her armored flight deck was approximately 266 meters long. Her beam was 40 meters. She was powered by 12 Campon water tube boilers, driving 4 sets of turbines producing 150,000 total shaft horsepower, giving her a designed maximum speed of approximately 27 knots under favorable sea conditions. She was, in terms of her displacement and her dimensions, the most ambitious single naval construction project of the entire Second World War. She was also, in November of 1944, nowhere near operationally ready or technically complete for sea service. Her chief engineer had prepared a detailed technical report on her readiness for sea. The watertight doors that divided her interior into separate flooding-resistant compartments were not installed. Those doors were the primary mechanical mechanism that would prevent flooding in one area of the ship from spreading freely and uncontrolled to adjacent compartments. Without them, a torpedo hit that damaged one section of the ship's hull would allow water to flow through the interior without impediment. The pumping systems for removing water from flooded compartments were not operational. The damage control training that her crew would need to manage flooding in a combat emergency had not been conducted. Civilian construction workers from the Yokosuka arsenal were still aboard the ship, completing tasks that had not been finished before the commissioning date. The commissioning ceremony on November 19th was premature in the most practical technical sense. The Shinano was not ready to go to sea. The engineers and the shipyard officers knew this. The flag officers responsible for the arsenal and the carrier's readiness knew this. The decision to commission her and sail her immediately to the Kure naval base for completion of her fitting out was driven by the growing threat of American B-29 air raids on the Yokosuka naval arsenal. American long-range B-29 bombers had begun striking the Japanese home islands from the bases captured in the Marianas over the summer of 1944. Yokosuka, one of Japan's primary naval construction and ship repair facilities, was a logical and entirely predictable bombing target. Having the largest warship in the world sitting exposed at Yokosuka when the B-29s arrived was considered an unacceptable and unnecessary risk. She would be moved to the Kure naval base on the Seto Inland Sea, where the remaining fitting-out work could be completed in relative safety. Commander Joseph Francis Enright was on his 5th war patrol, commanding the USS Archerfish, a WW2 submarine, when he encountered the Shinano on the night of November 28th. His patrol to that point had not been productive in the sense of producing attack targets. His assigned mission for that specific period was lifeguard duty, meaning positioning the Archerfish near the Japanese coastline to rescue American aviators who had been shot down during B-29 raids on Tokyo. The B-29 bombing raids scheduled for November 28th, the same day the Shinano sailed from Yokosuka, were cancelled because of adverse weather conditions over Japan. The Archerfish therefore had no rescue mission to perform either that day or during the following night. She was patrolling the approaches to Tokyo Bay when her surface radar detected a very large surface contact, leaving Yokosuka in the early evening hours of November 28, 1944. Enright had carried a specific and professionally painful history with missed opportunities to sink Japanese carriers. During a previous patrol, he had tracked a large Japanese warship that he subsequently declined to attack, judging the tactical angle unfavorable. The ship he had declined to attack was later identified as the fleet carrier Shokaku, which was sunk by another American submarine days afterward. Enright's professional reputation within the Pacific Submarine Force had suffered from that decision. His career had continued, but the specific knowledge that he had passed on one of the largest targets of the Pacific War and then watched another boat sink, it had stayed with him through 4 more patrols in the Pacific. The contact his radar detected on the evening of November 28th was enormous in a way that was immediately apparent. He tracked the contact for 6 hours on the surface before committing to a submerged torpedo attack. The extended surface track was necessary because the Archerfish's surface speed barely exceeded the Shinano's transit speed of approximately 19 knots. Enright needed to move ahead of the carrier on a parallel course, then cut across in front of her, and position the Archerfish for a submerged attack from the side. The carrier was running an anti-submarine evasion pattern, which complicated the tracking, but did not make it impossible. What simplified it was that one of the Shinano's engine bearings overheated during the transit, forcing her to reduce speed to 18 knots, which was effectively the same as the Archerfish's surface speed. Once the bearing failure was reported and her speed was reduced, the carrier could no longer outrun the Archerfish on a sustained basis. Rear Admiral Toshio Abe, commanding the escort group from the Shinano, made the tactical assessment that he was facing a wolf pack of multiple American submarines rather than a single boat. This assessment was completely incorrect. There was only one submarine in those waters that night. Abe maneuvered his force in response to a threat that was actually a single WW2-class boat, sending his destroyers to screen against submarines on multiple bearings simultaneously rather than concentrating them on the one bearing where the Archerfish was. One of the 3 escorting destroyers passed directly over the submerged Archerfish without detecting her by sonar. In his maneuvering to evade the imagined wolfpack, Abe turned the Shinano directly toward the Archerfish's position at 2:56 in the morning of November 29th, 2 hours and 21 minutes before Enright fired. A few minutes later, he turned her southwest again, presenting her entire portside broadside to the Archerfish at a range of approximately 1,400 yards. It was, in Enright's own account, a nearly perfect firing situation for a submerged torpedo attack. At 3:15 in the morning, Enright fired 6 torpedoes at the carrier's exposed portside. He watched 2 detonations erupt against the carrier's hull before the Archerfish dove hard to 400 feet to ride out the depth charge attack he expected to follow. He heard the sounds of additional strikes. He heard what the crew described as loud structural breaking up noises from the target. The noises continued for 47 minutes before finally stopping. 4 of the 6 torpedoes struck the Shinano's hull. The first torpedo hit her farthest aft. Over the next 30 seconds, the remaining 3 hits walked forward along the port hull, each striking approximately 10 feet below the waterline. The explosions immediately flooded several compartments and killed the men stationed in them. The Shinano began listing to starboard within minutes of the first hit. The crew in the lower sections of the ship could see the water rising and moved rapidly toward the hatches above them. On the bridge and upper levels, Abe and his senior officers initially assessed the damage as manageable and survivable. They had personally seen torpedo hits on ships before. Smaller ships had absorbed similar torpedo damage and remained afloat. Abe ordered the Shinano to proceed at maximum speed toward the coast of Honshu, where she might reach shallow enough water to be beached before she sank. This was the operationally wrong decision for a ship with the Shinano's specific damage characteristics. Flooding without watertight doors to contain it follows the path that water takes, and maximum speed forces water through a damaged hull at a higher rate than the ship would flood at rest. The pumping systems that would remove water from the flooding compartments were not operational. The damage control parties, who should have been managing the flooding systematically, had not been trained to manage flooding on a ship of the Shinano's size and complexity. The list increased progressively. The flooding spread from compartment to compartment through the spaces where watertight doors should have been installed but were not. At 10 in the morning of November 29th, Abe recognized that the ship was going to sink regardless of what was attempted. He issued the order to abandon ship. Then he remained aboard the ship he had commanded. At 10:57 in the morning, 7 hours and 42 minutes after the torpedoes struck, the Shinano rolled onto her side and capsized. 1,435 of those aboard were still inside the ship when it went under and were lost. They died inside her because the watertight doors that had not been installed could not stop the flooding. The flooding spread through the ship's interior without compartment barriers to slow it. A 72,000-ton ship without internal watertight integrity sinks faster than 2,500 people can be evacuated from the spaces below her flight deck. The specific history of the Shinano's conversion from battleship to carrier explains the tension between her dimensions and her operational readiness. After Midway, the IJN faced the specific decision of what to do with a partially complete battleship hull that was already too far advanced in construction to be economically abandoned. Completing her as a battleship was not strategically useful. Midway had demonstrated that carrier aviation, not battleship guns, decided naval engagements. Completing her as a functional fleet carrier was not technically feasible without demolishing significant sections of the existing hull and starting again. The intermediate solution, converting her into a support carrier, produced the largest warship ever built while preserving the existing construction investment. The result was a ship of the wrong type for maximum utility, built on a hull not optimally suited for the role it was filling, and rushed into service at a time when Japanese naval construction capacity was already stretched beyond its effective limits. The 50 Oka aircraft aboard her represented what Japan expected the Shinano's support role to produce. The Oka was a piloted rocket-powered flying bomb designed to be carried under the wing of a mother aircraft and released near enemy warships, at which point the human pilot would ignite the solid fuel rockets and guide the weapon directly into its target. It was the most extreme expression of the kamikaze concept. Not a pilot flying an ordinary aircraft into a ship, but a pilot seated inside a purpose-built weapon, with no controls other than those needed to aim it at its target in the final seconds before impact. The 50 Okas were destined for the naval forces fighting in the Philippines. They never arrived and were never used. The Archerfish's design was the functional opposite of the Shinano's in every relevant dimension. She displaced 1,526 tons, fully loaded. She was 95 meters long, with a beam of approximately 8 meters. She was crewed by approximately 80 officers and enlisted men. She carried 24 torpedoes and 6 torpedo tubes forward, with 4 more aft. Her rated maximum surface speed was slightly over 20 knots in calm sea conditions. She had been commissioned on September 4, 1943, at Portsmouth Navy Yard in New Hampshire. She had completed 4 patrols before the one on which she sank the Shinano, without having sunk any confirmed surface targets in any of the first 3. The Archerfish was a competent and unremarkable submarine that happened to be in the right position when the largest warship ever built came out of Tokyo Bay, without the watertight doors that should have been installed before commissioning. The 6 hours that Enright spent tracking the Shinano before his attack were a sustained surface pursuit that required continuous recalculation of the carrier's base course and intended speed. The Shinano was zigzagging on an anti-submarine pattern, which meant that tracking her intended base course required Enright to calculate from her zigzag deviations what direction she was actually trying to go. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Bobzinski, helped Enright work out the geometry of the intercept. They concluded through calculation that the carrier's base course was approximately 210 degrees due southwest. They positioned the Archerfish ahead of and to one side of that projected course to give the submarine time to submerge before the carrier arrived. When the carrier's engine bearing overheated and forced her to reduce speed, the geometry simplified. A ship that cannot outrun a pursuing submarine cannot escape on a straight line. The Shinano's zigzagging continued to periodically bring her closer to the Archerfish rather than consistently away from it. The depth charge attack that the Japanese destroyers conducted in response to Enright's torpedo salvo was intense but not effective. The Archerfish dove to 400 feet, which was at or near her designed safe diving depth, to get below the effective detonation depth of the Japanese depth charges. The depth charges detonated at shallower depths, above the Archerfish's position. Enright and his crew tracked the sounds of the sinking carrier from 400 feet of depth, while the Japanese destroyers searched for them in the water above. The structural breaking up noises from the carrier lasted 47 continuous minutes. Enright and his crew recorded what they heard and submitted it in their patrol report. Enright's crew did not know what ship they had struck and sunk. They knew only that it was extraordinarily large. They had seen the silhouette at 3:15 in the moonlight for a few moments before submerging. Enright estimated the target at 68,000 tons, which was considerably larger than any aircraft carrier that American intelligence had documented as existing in the Japanese fleet. The Archerfish completed her 5th war patrol and returned to Guam on December 15, 1944. The official patrol report listed a 28,000-ton carrier of the Hayataki-class, which was the closest match available in the recognition manuals to what Enright had sketched from memory of the silhouette. The 1,080 survivors of the Shinano were rescued from the water by the 3 escorting destroyers in the hours after the sinking. They were transported not to a naval base, where their accounts and testimony could be processed through normal channels, but to Mitsukijima, a small island in the Seto Inland Sea, where they were quarantined and held in isolation until January of 1945. The quarantine was imposed specifically to prevent news of the sinking from reaching the Japanese public, the press, and the broader military command structure. The largest warship Japan had ever built had been sunk on its very first voyage by a single American submarine that had not previously sunk any confirmed surface targets on any of its previous 4 patrols. The implications for Japanese morale and for Japanese strategic planning were severe enough that the Imperial Japanese Navy chose to suppress the information entirely and indefinitely rather than make any public acknowledgement of the loss. The survivors spent approximately 6 weeks isolated on Mitsukijima under conditions that the historical record does not describe in any surviving detail. The official credit that the United States Navy gave Commander Enright for his 5th War Patrol was the sinking of a Japanese aircraft carrier of approximately 28,000 tons. The Navy listed the target as a Yamato-class carrier and gave the credit to the Archerfish. The award was the Navy Cross. Enright accepted the award, returned the Archerfish to Guam, and submitted his patrol report. He had described the silhouette he had seen under moonlight at 3:15 in the morning. He had estimated the target displacement at 68,000 tons. Naval intelligence reviewed his estimate and concluded that no known Japanese carrier of that displacement existed in the fleet. The closest match in the recognition manuals was the 28,000-ton figure. That was the figure that went into the official record. The true size and identity of what the Archerfish had sunk was not known to the Americans until after the war ended. When Allied intelligence teams examined Japanese naval records and interviewed Japanese naval officers in the autumn of 1945, the identity and true displacement of the ship sunk on November 29th became unambiguously clear. The Shinano, 72,000 tons, the largest warship ever built, sunk on her first and only voyage, 10 days after commissioning. Enright was formally informed of what his Navy Cross had actually been awarded for. The Archerfish held the record at the time and still holds it, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine in any navy, in any war in recorded naval history. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is what made the Shinano's sinking possible despite her size, why the largest warship ever built was at sea 10 days after commissioning without the doors that should have kept her afloat, what the survivors' quarantine tells us about how Japan understood the loss, and why the Archerfish, which sank the largest warship ever built, was itself sunk 24 years later by a torpedo from another American submarine. Do not go anywhere. The technical analysis of why the Shinano sank is the analysis of a failure cascade. It was not the torpedo hits alone that sank her. 4 torpedo hits on a ship of 72,000 tons, properly sealed and manned by a trained damage control crew, could be managed. The Yamato absorbed a minimum of 11 torpedo hits at Okinawa before sinking. The Musashi absorbed approximately 19 torpedo hits at Leyte Gulf before sinking. The Shinano sank on 4 torpedo hits because the watertight doors that should have contained the flooding were not installed. She sank because her bilge pumps were not fully operational. She sank because her damage control crew had not been trained to handle flooding on a ship of her size and complexity. She sank because Rear Admiral Abe ordered maximum speed towards shore, which increased the rate at which water entered through the torpedo damage. She sank because the combination of those 4 factors was irreversible within the time available. The specific design of the Shinano created an additional vulnerability that the torpedo damage exposed. The junction between the armor belt and the anti-torpedo blister was a structural point where the Americans Mark the 15th have torpedoes, set to run at a depth calculated to strike that junction, could cause maximum damage. The Archerfish's torpedoes were configured for a running depth of 10 feet, which matched the calculated vulnerable zone for the Shinano's specific hull design. This was not the result of specific intelligence about the Shinano's structural vulnerabilities. It was the standard torpedo depth setting for attacks on large Japanese warships in 1944. The match between the torpedo depth and the Shinano's structural weakness was operational coincidence rather than specific targeting. The role of maximum speed in accelerating the flooding deserves specific attention because it represents the most consequential decision made after the torpedoes struck. Abe's reasoning was that the coast of Honshu was approximately 200 kilometers away, and that if he could reach shallower water, he could beach the Shinano before she sank. The reasoning was not unreasonable, given what Abe knew at the moment he made the decision. What he did not fully account for was that the Shinano's internal structure was not compartmentalized against flooding in the way that a normally completed ship would be. At maximum speed, water pressure against the damaged hull sections increased proportionally. At maximum speed, water moved through the ship's interior at a higher rate than it would at rest. The pumps that would have removed water from the flooding sections were not operational. The speed that was intended to save the ship accelerated its destruction. The survivors quarantined on Mitsukijima represent a specific institutional response to a specific institutional problem. Japan could not acknowledge the loss of the Shinano publicly for several reasons. The existence of the Shinano was not publicly known. She had been built in secret, her commissioning had not been announced, and her existence was known outside the Navy's senior command structure, primarily through the workers who had built her and the crew who had sailed on her. Acknowledging the loss of the Shinano would have required acknowledging that the Shinano had existed, which would have revealed that Japan had been building a warship whose existence it had classified. Beyond the secrecy issue, the scale of the loss was strategically catastrophic. The largest warship ever built, sunk by a single submarine on its first voyage, 2 weeks before Christmas of 1944, when the strategic situation was already deteriorating. The quarantine was the Navy's solution to the problem of how to process 1,080 witnesses to a disaster it could not acknowledge. May 1940. Keel of the third Yamato-class battleship laid at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. June 1942. Battle of Midway. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk. Decision made to convert the Shinano hull to a carrier. November 19, 1944. Shinano commissioned at Yokosuka. Watertight doors not installed. Bilge pumps not operational. Civilian workers still aboard. November 28, 1944, approximately 1900 hours. Shinano departs Yokosuka. Archerfish detects her on surface radar. November 28th to 29th, 1930 to 3:15. Archerfish tracks Shinano for 6 hours. Engine bearing overheats. Shinano reduced to 18 knots. November 29th, 2:56 a.m. Abe maneuvers Shinano toward Archerfish to evade imagined wolfpack. November 29th, 3:15 a.m. Archerfish fires 6 torpedoes, 4 hit. Shinano begins listing. November 29th, 10 a.m. Abe orders abandon ship. November 29th, 10:57 a.m. Shinano capsizes and sinks. 1,435 dead, 1,080 survivors. December 15th, 1944. Archerfish returns to Guam. Filed as Hayatake-class carrier, 28,000 tons. January 1945. Shinano survivors released from quarantine on Mitsukijima. August 1945. War ends. Allied intelligence teams begin examining Japanese naval records. Autumn 1945. True identity of Archerfish's target confirmed. Shinano, 72,000 tons. October 1968. Archerfish sunk by torpedo from USS Snook during training exercise. 4 factors explain the sinking of the Shinano. Incomplete watertight integrity, the decision to sail before she was ready, Abe's tactical error that presented her broadside to the Archerfish, and the maximum speed decision after the torpedo hits. The first factor was the missing watertight doors. A ship of 72,000 tons can absorb significant torpedo damage if its internal compartmentalization contains the flooding. The Shinano's internal compartmentalization was incomplete. The engineers who had built her knew this. The chief engineer had formally requested a delay before sailing. The request was denied. The reason it was denied was that the B-29 threat to Yokosuka was considered more urgent than the risk of sailing a ship without complete watertight integrity. This was a calculation that the events of November 29, 1944, proved wrong. The second factor was the premature departure. The Shinano was not ready to sail in November of 1944. She was not ready to fight, and she was not ready to absorb battle damage. The decision to commission her and move her to Kure was the decision of an organization under external pressure, making an internal compromise that traded technical readiness for strategic safety. The B-29s were real. The risk to Yokosuka was real. But the risk of sailing an incomplete ship in waters patrolled by American submarines was also real, and it was the risk that materialized. The third factor was Abe's tactical error. The Archerfish would not have had the firing position it achieved without the maneuver that Abe made in response to his incorrect assessment of a wolfpack threat. A carrier escort that correctly identified a single submarine and concentrated its destroyers on that one bearing. would have been much more likely to drive the Archerfish off before she could gain a firing position. Abe divided his escorts in response to a threat that did not exist, and in doing so, presented the largest warship ever built broadside to a submarine that had been hunting her for 6 hours. The fourth factor was the maximum speed decision. If Abe had slowed the Shinano after the torpedo hits, rather than ordering maximum speed, the rate of flooding would have been lower. The pumps that were operational might have had more time to work. The flooding might have been slowed enough to allow more time for evacuation. It might not have been enough. The ship was structurally compromised from the moment the first torpedo hit. But the maximum speed decision removed the possibility of testing whether the ship could have survived at reduced speed long enough to do anything other than lose 1,435 people inside her. The paradox at the center of the sinking of the Shinano is not subtle, but it is worth stating precisely. The Shinano was converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull because Midway proved that aircraft carriers were the decisive naval weapon and battleships were the secondary one. She was converted into a carrier to serve the carriers that would continue the carrier war that Japan was losing. She was rushed into service because B-29s launched from the Marianas were threatening Yokosuka. Those Marianas bases had been captured after island campaigns that Japan lost precisely because it no longer had the carrier aviation to defend them. The same campaign that destroyed Japanese carrier aviation at the Philippine Sea, making the Shinano conversion necessary, produced the Marianas bases that the B-29s flew from, making the Shinano's premature departure necessary. She was sunk by a submarine that was on lifeguard duty for B-29 aviators, returning from the raids on Japan that had made the Shinano's premature sailing necessary. The Archerfish was waiting in the waters the Shinano was sailing through because the B-29s were flying. The B-29s were flying because Japan had lost the carrier war. The Shinano was sailing in an incomplete state because Japan was losing the carrier war. The Shinano was sunk by the immediate consequence of the strategic conditions that had made building her seem necessary. The Archerfish returned to service after her 5th patrol and completed several more war patrols before the war ended. Joseph Enright was promoted to captain and later to rear admiral. He wrote his memoirs after the war and described the Shinano patrol in detail. He died in the year 2000 at the age of 86. The Archerfish was decommissioned from active service in 1968 and used as a training vessel. On October 6, 1968, she was sunk by a torpedo fired from the USS Snook during a training exercise to be used as an anti-submarine warfare practice target. The submarine that had sunk the largest warship ever built was sunk in a training exercise by the USS Snook 24 years later. The largest warship ever built lasted exactly 10 days. The submarine that sank it lasted 24 years before a torpedo ended its service. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you the stories the naval histories reduce to a footnote and a displacement figure, without telling you that the Archerfish was on rescue duty for B-29s that did not fly the day she sank the Shinano, that the largest warship ever built was sent to sea without its watertight doors installed, because B-29s launched from the very islands whose capture had necessitated the Shinano conversion were threatening the arsenal where she was built, that the survivors of the sinking were quarantined for 6 weeks on a small island because the Imperial Japanese Navy could not acknowledge that the Shinano had existed, let alone that she had been sunk on her maiden voyage by a single submarine, or that the Archerfish was herself sunk 24 years later in a training exercise. Hit subscribe, then like so. This reaches the people who should understand what 1,435 dead inside the largest carrier ever built in 10 days means about the relationship between the weapons a Navy builds and the conditions under which it is forced to use them. Drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one. The record established by the Archerfish on November 29, 1944, stands without challenge or qualification 80 years later. The Shinano at 72,000 tons displacement was the largest warship sunk by a submarine in any war in naval history. The record has not been remotely approached since. No warship of comparable size has been sunk by any submarine since 1944. The Archerfish achieved this record on her 5th patrol, on a mission that was not hunting warships, with a contact that was detected by surface radar rather than by any specific intelligence about the Shinano's position or route. The technical factors that made the sinking possible were already present before the Archerfish detected her target: an incomplete ship, a crew without damage control preparation, missing watertight doors, and non-operational pumps. The conversion of the Shinano from a battleship hull to a carrier was itself an acknowledgement that Japan had lost the carrier war before the Shinano became operational. The Yamato and the Musashi, the 2 completed battleships of the Yamato-class, were kept out of combat operations for 2 years because the decisive naval weapon was the carrier and the battleship was obsolete in its intended role. Converting the 3rd hull of that class into a carrier was a recognition that the decisive weapon had changed and that Japan needed more carriers. Japan needed more carriers because it had lost the carriers it had. It had lost those carriers because American carrier aviation had defeated Japanese carrier aviation in sequence at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Philippine Sea. The Shinano was built to partially replace what Midway and the Philippine Sea had destroyed. She was sunk on her maiden voyage 10 days after commissioning before she could replace anything. The technical specifications of the Archerfish's Mark 13 torpedoes and their relationship to the Shinano's structural design produced an effect that was more devastating than either factor would have been separately in a different configuration. The Mark 13 torpedo was designed to run at an adjustable depth and to detonate on contact rather than under the keel. Set to run at 10 feet, the depth that Archerfish used, it struck the Shinano at approximately the junction between the armored belt and the lower hull, where the anti-torpedo blister had been incorporated into the design. The armor belt was designed to stop armor-piercing shell penetrations and to absorb torpedo hits above the waterline. The blister was designed to absorb torpedo detonations before the blast reached the main hull. At the specific depth where the Mark 14 torpedoes ran that night, they struck the transition between these 2 design elements, where neither the belt nor the blister was fully optimized to absorb the impact. 4 hits at that depth produced structural damage that the Shinano's incomplete internal compartmentalization could not contain. The question of what Enright knew during the attack about the nature of his target has been examined in detail through his patrol report and his post-war memoirs. He knew it was very large. He had estimated 68,000 tons before he submerged. He knew it had an escort of 3 destroyers that would have been appropriate for a fleet carrier. He knew it was traveling at a speed that required him to pursue it at maximum surface speed for more than 6 hours. He did not know it was the Shinano specifically. He did not know it had incomplete watertight integrity. He did not know the damage he was inflicting was being amplified by the ship's unfinished internal structure. He knew that the carrier was sinking from the sounds he tracked from 400 feet. He did not know, until intelligence teams in 1945 told him that he had sunk the largest warship in history on its first and only voyage. The Shinano's crew had been assembled and assigned to a ship that had not been in service long enough for them to function as a coordinated crew in any operational sense. The officers had been aboard for weeks, and the enlisted men had been assigned in November of 1944. None of them had ever managed flooding on the Shinano because the Shinano had never experienced flooding before the torpedoes struck. None of them had practiced the specific damage control procedures for a ship of 72,000 tons, because those procedures had not yet been written for the Shinano specifically. They had whatever damage control training their previous assignments had provided and whatever knowledge they had absorbed from the weeks of preparation before the ship departed Yokosuka. When the water began rising after the torpedo hits, they worked with what they had. What they had was not enough, and the ship was not equipped to give them more time to work with. The Archerfish and Enright received additional recognition after the war when the true identity of the target became known. Enright's original Navy Cross, awarded for the sinking of what was recorded as a 28,000-ton carrier, was recognized as having been awarded for a substantially more significant achievement. The submarine force recognized the Archerfish patrol as the most successful single patrol of the Pacific War in terms of the displacement tonnage of a single target sunk. Enright received additional formal recognition from the submarine force. He went on to a full naval career after the war, eventually rising to Rear Admiral. He was one of the few submarine commanders who would eventually learn, from official post-war records, that he had accomplished what no submarine commander before or since has matched: the sinking of the largest warship ever built. On a mission, he was not assigned, against a target he could not identify in the dark until it was already sinking.